Hello everybody.
Hello.
Welcome. My name is Joakim Landahl. I am an educational historian from Stockholm University. And today I'm going to speak about the history of crisis in education. So to clarify, what I'm going to talk about is the idea of crisis. It's not the crisis in itself, but different kinds of constructions of crisis over time and how they shift. So I will provide an overview of discussions about the crisis of education dating back from the 50s and then onwards to the recent decades. And what I will present here is some preliminary findings from a research project that we have three scholars from 3 universities. It's me and it's David Sjögren from Uppsala University and Johannes Westberg from Lund University. And these are some of the preliminary findings, so we will go on for 2 more years with this research project. When we discuss the crisis of education today, it's quite common to discuss it in terms of something that happened quite recently, and a recurrent narrative is to describe a school system that worked well and then quite suddenly stopped working well. This is one of the articles out of numerous describing this change. What about if we could turn the school clock back to 1990? That has become a quite usual way of describing it. However, if we actually turn back the school clock to 1990 or at least 1987, we might find people discussing education without being feeling that they actually lived in a golden age at that time. So this is an article series from Aftonbladet in 1997. It was the biggest article series that they had ever produced. They wrote more than 100 articles about education in Sweden. And it covered articles with themes like Swedish schools are falling apart, school meals are bad, mass escape from the teaching profession, 45 pupils are bullied in schools, developing countries beat us in math, 8 out of 10 forget what they learned at physics, etc. And then they ended with one good news though, the sales of Aftonbladet decreased again. So. And in our project, we do a lot of analysis of newspaper articles. This is quite easy today since they have been digitalized. So you can search for them on a database that the Royal Library has constructed. And if you search different combination of crisis and education, you will find articles from the 50s and onwards. Before the 50s, they didn't combine the word crisis and education. Probably there was a crisis rhetoric at that time as well, but they had different words. Then we also use different kinds of books as well, debating the nature of school in different times. These are books about the crisis of education dating back from the 50s, 60s, and the 70s.
Excuse me.
is the point of investigation the concept of crisis, like it's some kind of discourse analysis?
Yes.
Or, yeah.
Yeah. That is. Yeah. So some points of departure for this presentation and also for the project, I would say, is crisis is a recurrent theme in educational discourse. Something that we see as a, not all the time, but it's coming back regularly. But also a concept that changes its meaning over time. So it's both change and continuity here. And I would actually like to stress quite a lot the changing aspect of it. Although we have different ideas of crisis, it's not the same crisis, and I will come back to that later. And an aspect of that is, of course, crisis as a construction, as a different ideas of what kind of crises are being highlighted or which kind of crises are not being highlighted in the discussions about schooling. And then a third point is crisis as a source of power and influence over educational discourse and policy. One article that has been quite interesting for me when it comes to understanding how educational crises are play a role or not play a role in society is Gita Kamsi's study of international assessments. And she has written a study called The Politics of League Tables, where she compares different kind of policy reactions in Germany towards two different international assessments. She compared the reactions towards the Pisa study, Pisa 2000, and the IA civic education study. And what she found was that, she means that there are different kind of policy reactions towards those international assessments. There's scandalization, which means highlighting the weaknesses of one's own education system. Glorification, that is the opposite, highlighting the strengths, if it goes good in an international assessment. Then we have indifference. You don't care about the results. So Germany, what was interesting is that in 2001 they had two international assessments produced, both with quite bad results. The Pisa 2000 created what became known as the Pisa shock. There was very much what we call here scandalization of the education system. Then there was the IA civic education study, which showed that Germany had the highest, were the most xenophobic country of the participant countries, which was really not a good result. But that was met with indifference in educational discussions in Germany. So this is an example of how the results in themselves can never totally explain the results of whether something is scandalized or not. Another aspect that is quite important in the project is crisis definition as a source of power, because this has to do with the question of why is it important to study the history of educational crisis or the ideas of the educational crisis. So one argument would be that they play a central role in educational policy. They are an important mechanism that affects what kind of ideas that get discussed and what is actually changed later on in policy. So, this is like a short introduction to the project. And in this presentation I will do, this is divided in three parts. We'll first discuss the success or failure of crisis narratives exemplified by the US and Sweden in the 1980s, and how they yeah. And then I will briefly go through different kinds of crises that have been constructed in education discourse. And finally, I will discuss ideas of solutions for educational crisis. So, starting with the question of how a crisis narrative succeeds, I will discuss two opposite cases of two similar attempts at establishing a crisis narrative. The first from the USA, with a very classical crisis report that was written. The background was the following. Ronald Reagan had promised to abolish the education department in his presidential campaign, which he didn't do. Actually, Donald Trump has promised the same thing. And he promised to, he thought that federal spending on schools should be reduced. Now, to abolish the education department, you need to have an education minister that actually gets down his own work. And that was this man, Terrell H. Bell. He has written an interesting account of his time as a minister. Terrell Bell did not want to abolish the education department. He wanted to keep it. The question was how. Anyway, he invented a strategy. We shouldn't say that this was to keep the education department, but that made it stay. In August 1981, he decided to create a crisis commission. The New York Times wrote that he was planning to establish a national commission on excellence in education to reverse what he describes as a nationwide problem of declining college entrance scores and to ensure high standards of achievement. And he has written about this in his biography. We needed some means of rallying the American people around their schools and colleges. Educators also needed to be shaken out of their complacency. More than 2 decades ago, the Soviet Sputnik had spurred us into action to improve education standards and performance. We needed an equally powerful spur today. I wanted to stage an event that would jar the people into action on behalf of their educational system. Since I could not realistically plan on another Sputnik type occurrence, I had to search for an alternative. So this alternative was this commission. But when I took this idea to the White House, it was met with diffidence or scorn. People don't pay attention to federal reports, I was told. Federal commissions are so ineffective that they go unnoticed, I heard. Education is a local and state responsibility was a common reaction. So they were skeptical, but he managed to make this commission come into reality and to write this classical report from 1983, A Nation at Risk. And this report was not met with, what was his formulation, that people didn't pay attention to it. Many did. Anyway, and it had this kind of rhetoric, this report. The educational foundations of our society are presently being eroded by a rising tide of mediocrity that threatens our very future as a nation and a people. If an unfriendly foreign power had attempted to impose on America the mediocre education performance that exists today, we might well have viewed it as an act of war. So this is very strong language in the report. And to rebel actually managed to make Ronald Reagan present it. So it became a very public, media-adapted story with this report. And it became also a very big success in terms of public dissemination. The report was actually printed in 600,000 copies, and it had a media coverage which was very extensive. And he says, our press clipping services revealed that the Commission's report was on the front page of all the major newspapers in every city, small, medium and large, across the nation. Editorials appeared the next day. The news on the 3 major TV networks featured a nation at risk. I was an instant celebrity. So he became really this public figure that managed to define what the problem with education was. And of course, there has these kinds of such success could, of course, be mimicked in other countries. If it works in the US, why doesn't it work in other places? There's a scholar that has studied this from the Japanese perspective. So the article is called A Nation at Risk Crosses the Atlantic. It discusses how the rhetoric was used in Japan also. What about Sweden? Was Sweden a nation at risk? Did someone pick up what happened here in the United States? Yes? Someone did. So, in 1989, Carl Bildt proposed that the school needed a crisis commission. In a speech and later in an article, he wrote about this. So he said that the school had problems with vandalism, teacher shortage, bullying, low knowledge standards, and a growing number of functional analphabets. And he referred to the American example with a nation at risk, and he said that Sweden is also a nation at risk. I think that an independent school commission is what is needed to open the eyes on the ones with eyes shut and to make way for new solutions. So here we have an example of a politician who is engaging tries to engage in what people have described as crisis exploitation. Or with a more neutral word, crisis definition or something like that, crisis construction. Now, the decisive factor here is whether he would reach support for this proposal. One of the newspapers, Svenska Dagbladet, was very, very much in favor of this suggestion. They really wanted Moderaterna and Folkpartiet to start this commission by themselves and not wait for other political parties. However, Folkpartiet they were very much against this. So Bengt Westerberg, the party leader of Folkpartiet, said that the talk about crisis in the school is a considerable exaggeration. And after this, as far as I have been able to see, the ideas about a crisis commission from the Moderaterna ended, or the proposals. So they dropped the idea of a crisis commission. And instead, about two years later, they launched the idea of international competitiveness and formulated a vision of being the best in Europe. So that was, in a way, slightly different idea. So these two examples, then the US and the Sweden and the crisis commissions, shows that in some circumstances, politicians manage to sell a narrative about crisis. Sometimes they fail, even spectacularly fail. So this is, of course, interesting to think about why that is the case. So that was that about that, and now I will speak, give a bit more historical overview of different kinds of crises that have been highlighted in especially the media. I actually see that I have written wrong here. It should be 2000 here. Okay, but we'll see. So, I will speak about three kinds of crisis: expansion crisis, alienation crisis, and performance crisis. The first, expansion crisis, that would be the first crisis that was written about much in the 50s. And that was a crisis that had to do with that we don't have enough schools. We have a wave of nativity that reaches already overcrowded schools. That was all the pupils born in the 40s that starts school in the 50s. So we have the demographical changes, and then we also have, in a way, democratical changes in the way that there was this strive to open up schools to more pupils and make more pupils go in longer in schools. The comprehensive school reform is emerging. So this means that we have too few teachers, too few school buildings. So the school crisis consists in this, to a large extent, in a lack of buildings that are not, so that are about to be built, which also created an interest in maybe experimenting with different kinds of buildings. Cheap schoolhouses out of glass without foundation was an article I found here. With Bruno Mattsson, the chair maker, what had been given the task to build this. And the background was by 1955 Sweden will need 10,000 new classrooms. There is a need for cheaper constructions and so on. And this was a kind of crisis that was, in a way, I think, experienced as a temporary crisis. This is a temporary problem that we will solve, and then we will be in another stage, sort of. So it's a sort of a modernizing crisis. So that was the 50s and 60s and so on. A approximately in the 1960s, 70s, there is another kind of crisis that tend to be described. And I call it the alienation crisis. It's a crisis that is about lack of meaning and understanding the purpose of schools. And you can see that in many different contexts. This is from a pupil magazine, Elevforum. The school suffers from a serious crisis. The lack of motivation among the pupils is disastrous. So motivation question. Here is another example from Expressen. The Swedish education system is in a crisis. Many pupils are fed up with the school already in lower secondary schools. They find the school uninteresting, meaningless. So meaning and question like that. Yet again, another article. The crisis in the school has many causes: lethargy, destructivity, lack of meaning, resignation. How can we, the teachers, learn anything about life when we don't know anything ourselves? And in this rhetoric, you can also see the policy implications described. I think this is an interesting example that illuminates the thoughts about this. This is Expressen, who in a very romantic way describes Rousseau as sort of a genius, while the school is described as a factory. And they really wonder who writes Emile today in 1978, the Rousseau book. We are in the midst of a school crisis, no one denies that. And they propose that school vouchers should be introduced and alternative schools should then flourish. And yeah, so here you can see how the criticism of the school as an alienating praxis also results in planting the seed for marketization and so on. So, which probably was not the idea, but maybe the result. And this was also part of a time when there was a lot of discussions about deschooling society and stressing different places where you learn rather than school. So that was the alienation crisis, and then the third crisis could be called performance crisis, and that is a construction of crisis that more stresses the results of education. This begins maybe. I mean, there is a longer history to this. Performance, there has been discussions about this also before, in the 70s and in the 60s, yeah. So that is maybe a discussion that has been going on quite recurrently. But I think it has been much more evident the last 2 decades. And one early sign is in the 90s when the introduction of the new grade system with a pass pass limit is introduced, and which is a new way of measuring school performance. And when you introduce a new way of measuring, you also introduce people who don't live up to those norms, and therefore you also get a new measurement of crisis. So these kinds of headlines is a result of also a result of a new way of measuring. That was obviously not possible to have those kinds of results in a relative grading system. And then most of all, of course, the most important change in the 21st century is the introduction of Pisa, which is after all, a novelty. Although there had been international assessments before, they had not had the same influence over educational discourse. And this was, especially in Germany, it became very much discussed already the first year. In Sweden, we didn't have so much discussion since we performed relatively well the first year. But then came the downfall, and then also the much more public presence of those studies in Sweden. And this and one of the aspects that this new way of measuring performance has resulted in is an increased focus on the nation as well. And it has meant a new way of understanding actually educational crisis. So we can compare these two books, one from the 60s and one from 2015. The first book, The World Educational Crisis, understood crisis as not connected to some particular countries, but rather like a global phenomenon that exists everywhere, more or less. So it understood crisis in the same way that we understand environmental crisis today. So, whereas discussions today are much more focused on the nation as the place where the crisis.
What are your evidence for that? Because I tend to see a lot of references to national school crisis way back, and so.
I mean, you have written yourself about this school that was singing the national anthem before they did a Pisa test. And I think, of course, I would say that problems of education have always been rooted in the national context.
But you mean more the competition between countries?
Yes, yeah. So that has really stressed the nationalistic character of the discussion, I would say. So finally, I would say some aspects about discussions about solutions. I think common for most, maybe all crises, is that they come with a very strong message. This has to be taken care of. It is very uncommon with people describing a crisis and then argue that they can't do anything about it. So part of the crisis genre is that it comes with attempts to explain the crisis in order to make it go away. So in that sense, you could say that the crisis is both dusk and dawn. It comes with hopelessness, but also hope for change. So it's not only a disaster, but also a form of potential renewal. And that makes it, this is an example of how the discussion could look. You portray two different future scenarios where you can either deteriorate even more, or you can even or you can end up with a better solution. Those could be, of course, more or less serious. And they can be on different levels and so on. But I think a common pattern, 5 minutes. Oh, yeah. A common pattern in the narrative about school crisis that have been described in previous research is the construction of the villain, the hero, and the victim. And this is then often structured around a kind of a polarization between us and them, between the, as in this quotation, between the Newtonian apple and the rotten apple, where there could be an attempt to find someone. Of course, this is not all crisis discussions, but it's a recurrent pattern. To find someone who is to blame. Also, this is quite important because if you know who to blame, then you know also what to do. And if you know who is the hero, then you know who to follow. So, for example, maybe the problem is the politicians, maybe the problem is the curriculum, Lgr 80, which is far too unclear about the knowledge goals. Maybe the problem is Olof Palme.
Maybe the problem are the parents sometimes.
Parents? Sometimes.
Maybe the policymakers are the problem because they don't want to make the job attractive.
Yeah.
They don't give power to teachers and they don't give good pay. And the problem also.
That could also be, yeah. Well, there could of course be many actors. It could be the Board of Education, or not anymore because it doesn't exist. Quite interestingly, I think very seldom teachers are explicitly held accountable. Rather the opposite. It's quite common to explicitly say that this is not because of the teachers. However, sometimes, maybe between the lines, they say that pupils are to blame. So these are, of course, sometimes strong allegations, and this can also feed the need for what has been called blame avoidance, where politicians or other policymakers. 1 minute. Okay, then we have the hero. That could be different kinds of persons. It could also be politicians, and people who are heroes could turn into villains and so on. It could be the OSV. And then it could be, in 1987, the pupils, as in this article series, where they actually made the pupils into the heroes in the fight against the school crisis. Many articles going on this. So thanks. I guess I'm out.